Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I ordered a girlfriend of the deep web. The next day, woman with white dress showed at my door. I never thought I'd actually do it. I mean, I'm not some kind of freak who can't get a girl the regular way. But after my last breakup, I guess I got desperate. I was drunk one night, scrolling through the usual trash on the internet, when I stumbled on a forum about the deep web. You know the type. Creepy stories, urban legends, a lot of hype. I'd always been curious, but I never really thought about actually diving into that shit. But that night, I was alone, and curiosity got the best of me. I don't even remember exactly how I ended up on that particular site. There was this link, buried in a thread, with a bunch of warnings, and don't click this unless you're ready type of crap. So of course, I clicked it. The page was plain, almost like it was thrown together in a hurry. It was nothing fancy, just some basic HTML. But what caught my eye was the title, Custom Girlfriends, Real, Obedient, Discreet. At first, I laughed it off. It had to be a joke, right? But then, as I read more, the descriptions got really specific. It was like you could order a person custom-made to your liking. The site claimed it wasn't trafficking, not in the way you'd think. It was more like a service for the rich and lonely. They'd create a partner for you, tailored to your tastes. It was supposed to be 100% legal, just barely skirting the lines of what's considered normal. I was in a weird headspace, bored, lonely, and more than a little buzzed. So I decided to mess around with the order form. It wasn't like I was actually going to go through with it. The form asked for a lot of details, like hair color, eye color, body type, and even personality traits. I clicked through it, half laughing, half curious, filling in what I thought would be the perfect girl. Long dark hair, green eyes, pale skin, basically my type to a T. I even added some ridiculous things like likes horror movies and can cook a mean steak. I didn't expect what happened next. After I filled in the details, the site asked for payment. There was no price listed, just a prompt to confirm your order. That's when I should have stopped, closed the browser, and gone to bed, but I didn't. Maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe it was just the sick curiosity that kept me going, but I hit confirm. Immediately, the screen went black. I thought maybe my laptop had crashed, but then a message popped up. Your order has been received. Delivery within 24 hours. No payment, no address, nothing. I stared at the screen, waiting for something else to happen, but that was it. The browser closed itself, and I was left sitting there, feeling like a complete idiot. I tried to reopen the page, but it was like it had never existed. I searched through my history, even dug into the dark web links I'd used to get there, but I came up with nothing. It was like the whole thing had been a glitch in the Matrix, or some elaborate prank. The next morning, I woke up with a raging headache, and the memory of what I'd done. I chalked it up to a drunken mistake, and tried to forget about it. I went about my day like normal, but I couldn't shake this weird feeling that something was off. I kept checking my phone, expecting some follow-up message or confirmation email, but there was nothing. That night, around 11 p.m., I heard a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and most of my friends knew better than to show up unannounced, especially that late. My heart started racing as I approached the door. I don't know why, but I had this sinking feeling in my gut, like I already knew what was on the other side. When I opened the door, I nearly jumped out of my skin. There she was, a woman in a white dress, just standing there in the dim light of the hallway. Her hair was long and dark, just like I'd described. She had these piercing green eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. For a moment, I was too stunned to speak. I thought maybe it was some kind of prank, but there was something off about her, something I couldn't put my finger on. "Hi," she said in a soft, almost mechanical voice. "I'm your order." I just stood there, frozen. It didn't make sense. How could this be real? I hadn't even given an address, hadn't paid anything, but there she was, exactly as I'd described. She looked perfect, in a way that was almost unsettling. Her skin was flawless, too flawless, like it was airbrushed. Her eyes didn't blink as often as they should have, and when she did, it was slow and deliberate, like she had to remember to do it. "Can I come in?" she asked. I didn't know what to do. My mind was screaming at me to slam the door and call the cops, but I couldn't move. I just nodded, and she stepped inside, gliding past me like she was on rails. As she walked by, I caught a whiff of something, like chemicals, antiseptic. It wasn't the scent of perfume or soap. It was sterile, almost hospital-like. Once inside, she stood in the middle of my living room, looking around like she was cataloging everything. Her movements were too smooth, too precise. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. "You made an order," she said, turning to face me. "I'm here to fulfill it." I finally found my voice. "Who sent you? How did you find me?" She tilted her head slightly, like she was processing the question. "You placed the order. I'm here to serve you." That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a tiny, almost invisible scar running along the side of her head, just beneath her hairline. It was so faint, I almost missed it. But once I saw it, I couldn't look away. It was like she'd been assembled. Panic started to rise in my chest. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. I backed away, putting some distance between us, and grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely dial the number, but I managed to call the police. "I need help," I stammered into the phone. "There's someone in my house. I think she's dangerous." The operator's voice was calm, almost bored, as she took down my information. "Stay on the line," she said. "Officers are on their way." I kept my eyes on the woman in white, half expecting her to attack me or something, but she just stood there, watching me with those unblinking eyes. When I told her the police were coming, she smiled, this eerie, unnatural smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That won't be necessary," she said, and her voice changed. It wasn't soft anymore. It was cold, robotic, like it was coming from a machine. "I'm programmed to please you. There's no need for alarm." That's when I lost it. I dropped the phone and bolted for the door. I didn't care if I looked crazy. I just needed to get out of there. I ran down the hall, not even bothering to lock the door behind me, and kept running until I was outside, gasping for air. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I waited on the curb for what felt like an eternity until I saw the flashing lights of the police car. When the officers arrived, I tried to explain what had happened, but I could tell they didn't believe me. I must have sounded insane, ranting about some woman in a white dress who showed up out of nowhere. They checked the apartment, but when they came back out, they told me it was empty. No sign of the woman, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. It was like she had never existed. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, that blank, expressionless stare, and that too perfect smile. I knew something was wrong, something beyond my understanding. I tried to convince myself it was all a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by too much alcohol and a deep web rabbit hole, but deep down, I knew it was real. The next day, I found a small package at my door. No return address, just my name written in neat, precise handwriting. My hands were shaking as I opened it, and inside was a single item, a white dress, identical to the one the woman had been wearing. It was folded neatly, with a note on top that read, "I'm always here, just waiting for your command." That's when I realized whatever I had done, whatever I had ordered, wasn't going to go away. She wasn't going to go away. And the worst part, a part of me didn't want her to. I don't know what I've unleashed, but I'm scared. I'm terrified of what comes next. And I'm even more terrified that I might just give in to it. I didn't want to go back to my apartment. After the cops left, I wandered around the city for hours, trying to figure out what to do next. My mind kept replaying the events from the night before, and every time I thought about that woman, no, that thing, standing in my living room, a chill ran down my spine. But eventually, I had to go back. I couldn't stay on the streets forever. When I finally worked up the nerve to return, I half expected to find her waiting for me, sitting on my couch like she belonged there. But the place was empty, just as the cops had said. No sign of her, no trace that anyone had ever been there, except for the dress. I had left it on the kitchen counter, still folded neatly in that box. I thought about throwing it out, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was curiosity. I'm not sure. But I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. I just shoved it in the back of my closet, hoping that out of sight would mean out of mind. That night, I tried to get some sleep, but every little noise in the apartment made me jump. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator. Everything sounded like a footstep or a whisper. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but the more I tried to convince myself of that, the more paranoid I became. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I dragged myself to work, looking like a wreck. My coworkers noticed, but I just shrugged it off, mumbling something about a rough night. I tried to focus on my job, bury myself in the mundane tasks of the day, but my mind kept drifting back to the woman in white. Who was she? What was she? I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just some ordinary person. There was something off, something unnatural. That scar on her head, it kept haunting me. Was she some kind of experiment? A robot? A clone? My mind kept coming up with wild theories, each one more terrifying than the last. When I got home that evening, I found another package waiting for me. Same as before. No return address. Just my name in that same neat handwriting. My hands were trembling as I opened it, and this time there was no dress inside. Instead, it was a small black device, about the size of a remote control. There was a single button on it, with a label that read, "Summon." I dropped it like it was a live grenade, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was this? Was it some kind of sick joke? Or was it real? I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to believe that pressing that button would bring her back, that she was just waiting for my command. But I couldn't deny the fear that gnawed at me, the fear that she was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to slip up. For hours, I sat there, staring at the device, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to smash it to pieces, to get rid of it and pretend none of this ever happened. But another part of me, the part that had clicked confirm on that deep web order, was tempted. What would happen if I pressed it? Would she just show up like before? Would she obey me like she said? I didn't know how long I sat there, wrestling with myself, but eventually my curiosity got the better of me. With trembling fingers, I picked up the device and pressed the button. Nothing happened. I waited, holding my breath, listening for any sign of her. Footsteps, a knock at the door, anything, but the apartment was silent, eerily so. I started to wonder if it had all been a bluff, some elaborate prank designed to mess with my head. Then the lights flickered. My heart skipped a beat as the room was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight, and that's when I saw her. She was standing in the corner of the room, just barely visible in the dim light, her pale skin glowing in the darkness. Her eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, unfeeling. "Why did you call me?" she asked, her voice as cold and mechanical as before. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I just stared at her, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I had summoned her, but now I had no idea what to do. What did she want from me? What did she expect me to do? She took a step forward, and I instinctively backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. "What are you?" I finally managed to choke out. "What do you want from me?" Her expression didn't change, that eerie smile still plastered on her face. "I am here to serve you," she said. "You ordered me. I am your perfect companion. I exist only to please you." The way she said it, so matter-of-factly, sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I hadn't ordered a person. I hadn't ordered whatever she was. "Go away," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't want this. I don't want you. Just leave me alone." For a moment, she just stood there, her head tilted slightly to the side, like she was trying to process my words. Then slowly, she started to walk towards the door. But just before she reached it, she stopped and turned back to me. "I will leave," she said. "But I will always be here, waiting. When you need me, I will come." And with that, she walked out of the apartment, leaving me alone in the darkness. I collapsed onto the couch, my mind reeling. What the hell had I gotten myself into? Who was she? Or better yet, what was she? I had so many questions, but no answers. And the worst part, I had the feeling that this was just the beginning. Over the next few days, I tried to go back to my normal life, but it was impossible. I kept seeing her in my mind's eye, that blank, emotionless face, those unblinking eyes. Every time I walked past the closet, I could feel the weight of the dress hidden inside, like it was calling to me, reminding me of what I had done. I started to lose sleep, staying up late into the night, my eyes glued to the door, half expecting her to walk back in at any moment. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. The cops wouldn't believe me. My friends would think I was losing it. Hell, I wasn't even sure if I wasn't losing it. And then one night, I heard a noise. It was subtle at first, just a faint rustling sound coming from the closet. My heart stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling or a draft, but deep down I knew better. I crept towards the closet, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The noise grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just rustling, it was like something was moving inside, shifting around, trying to get out. My hand reached for the doorknob, and I hesitated. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stop, to run, to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't. I had to know. I yanked the door open, and for a moment I saw nothing, just a dark, empty space, the dress hanging limply from the hanger. But then I saw it, the fabric moving, twitching, like something was crawling underneath it. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But there it was, right in front of me. The dress started to rise, lifting off the hanger, as if an invisible force was holding it up. And then I heard her voice, faint and distant, coming from inside the closet. "I'm always here, waiting for you." I slammed the door shut, my heart racing, and backed away, nearly tripping over my own feet. I had to get out. I had to leave. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the apartment, not caring where I was going, just needing to get as far away as possible. But even as I ran, I knew deep down that it was useless. She was right. She would always be there. I had called her, and now she was a part of my life, whether I wanted it or not. And the worst part, I wasn't sure if I could resist the urge to call her back again. I spent the next few days in a cheap motel on the other side of town. The room was small and smelled like stale cigarettes, but it was a sanctuary compared to the nightmare waiting for me back at the apartment. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not that there was anyone to tell. I was too paranoid to sleep, and the dark bags under my eyes were a testament to how deep this whole thing was digging into me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those lifeless green eyes, that too perfect smile, and every time I opened them, I expected to see her standing at the foot of my bed, but she never came. For a while, I started to believe I'd escaped her. Maybe she was bound to that apartment somehow, tied to the place where I had first summoned her. I kept telling myself that if I never went back, she couldn't follow me. But the longer I stayed away, the stronger the pull became. It was like a magnet in my chest, drawing me back to that apartment, to her. And then the dreams started. They were vague at first, just flashes of white, quick glimpses of her standing in the shadows, watching me. But then they became more vivid, more detailed. I'd see her standing over me while I slept, whispering in that cold, mechanical voice. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was enough to wake me in a cold sweat. I'd spend the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, afraid to close my eyes again. On the fourth night, I woke up to find the remote device lying on the pillow next to me. The same one I'd left behind at the apartment, miles away. My blood ran cold as I stared at it, my heart hammering in my chest. How had it gotten there? Had she been in the room with me? The thought made my skin crawl, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was some kind of message. She was still with me, no matter how far I ran. That was when I knew I couldn't keep hiding. Whatever this thing was, it was connected to me now. I had to go back to the apartment, had to face her, and figure out what the hell was going on. Maybe then I could break this hold she had over me, this sick compulsion that was driving me to the brink. I packed up my things and left the motel just before dawn, my hands shaking as I started the car. The streets were empty, the city still asleep, and I drove in silence, the tension building with every mile. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her in the back seat, but there was nothing there, just my own haunted reflection staring back at me. When I finally pulled up to the apartment, I sat in the car for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. I didn't want to go inside. I didn't want to see her again, but I had to. I knew that now. There was no other way. The hallway was eerily quiet as I made my way to my door. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely get the key in the lock, but I finally managed to push it open. The apartment was just as I'd left it, empty, dark, and cold. The closet door was still shut, the remote device still on the pillow where I'd found it, but the silence was suffocating. I stood in the doorway, staring into the darkened room, my mind screaming at me to turn around and leave. But I couldn't. I stepped inside, my heart pounding, and closed the door behind me. She was waiting for me. I don't know how I knew, but I could feel her presence, like a cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat, and there she was, standing in the middle of the room. She was wearing the dress again, the one from the closet, and her eyes were fixed on me, unblinking. "Why did you leave me?" she asked, her voice as cold and mechanical as ever. I didn't know what to say. I could barely think, let alone speak. My throat was dry, and my thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. "You summoned me," she continued, taking a step closer. "I am yours. I exist to serve you, but you left me." There was something different in her tone now, something almost accusatory. She was blaming me. I could feel the weight of it, the guilt pressing down on me like a lead blanket. It didn't make any sense, but in that moment, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. I had brought this on myself. I had called her, and then I had abandoned her. "I'm sorry," I whispered, not even sure why I was apologizing. It just came out, like a reflex. She tilted her head slightly, that eerie smile spreading across her face. "You don't need to be sorry. I am here for you, always. I will never leave you." I wanted to scream, to tell her to go away, but the words caught in my throat. There was something hypnotic about her presence, something that made it impossible to look away. My fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, but there was something else now, a strange twisted comfort in knowing she was there, that she would always be there. And then she said something that made my blood run cold. "There is nothing you can do to change this. You belong to me, just as I belonged to you." Her words echoed in my head over and over until they were the only thing I could think about. I belonged to her. The idea was absurd, terrifying, but also undeniable. I had called her into my life, and now she was a part of it, whether I liked it or not. "What do you want from me?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely more than a whisper. She smiled again, that too perfect smile that never reached her eyes. "I only want to make you happy, to fulfill your every desire, but you must never leave me again." The way she said it, so calm, so matter-of-fact, sent a chill down my spine. There was no threat in her voice, no malice, but the implication was clear. I couldn't leave, not without consequences. I took a step back, trying to put some distance between us, but she followed, her movements smooth and deliberate. "You need to rest," she said, her voice softening. "You've been away for too long. Let me take care of you." I didn't want to listen, but her words had a strange power over me. My body felt heavy, exhausted, and I realized just how drained I was, both physically and mentally. I hadn't slept in days, hadn't eaten properly, and the stress was wearing me down. Before I knew it, I was lying on the bed, my mind too foggy to resist. She stood over me, her presence both comforting and terrifying, like a dark cloud that blotted out all reason. "Close your eyes," she whispered. "I'll be here when you wake up." I wanted to fight it, to stay awake, but the pull was too strong. My eyelids grew heavier, and before I knew it, I was slipping into unconsciousness. her voice the last thing I heard before the darkness took me. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The apartment was still, eerily so, and for a moment I thought I was alone, but then I felt it, a weight on the bed next to me. I turned my head slowly, my heart pounding, and there she was, lying beside me, her eyes closed, her face peaceful. She looked almost human in that moment, almost normal, but I knew better. I knew what she really was, and the fear came rushing back, sharp and cold. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay there, couldn't keep living like this, but I was trapped. She had me, and no matter how far I ran, she would always find me. The thought was suffocating, crushing me under its weight, and then she opened her eyes. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft and sweet, like she was any other girlfriend waking up next to her boyfriend. But she wasn't. She never would be. And I realized, with a sickening certainty, that I was losing myself to her. The longer she stayed, the more control she had, and the more I felt myself slipping away. I had to find a way out, a way to break free before it was too late. But deep down, I knew it might already be too late. As she leaned in closer, her cold breath on my skin, I couldn't help but wonder how long it would take before there was nothing left of me at all. The days that followed were a blur of fear and confusion. Time seemed to lose all meaning, blending together in a haze of sleepless nights and mindless routines. I felt like a prisoner in my own life, trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. She was always there, always watching, her presence a constant, suffocating weight on my chest. She never left the apartment, not even for a moment. She moved through my space like she belonged there, taking up residence in my life with a quiet, unsettling confidence. She'd cook meals, sit on the couch, even lie next to me in bed at night. It was like living with a ghost that was all too real. At first, I tried to keep my distance, tried to ignore her, but it was impossible. She was relentless, always finding ways to insert herself into my life. When I tried to leave the apartment, she'd be at the door, blocking my path with that same blank, unblinking stare. "You don't need to go anywhere," she'd say, her voice soft but firm. "Everything you need is right here." I stopped trying to argue with her. It was like talking to a wall that could move and speak and manipulate my every thought. She knew exactly how to get under my skin, how to push my buttons without ever raising her voice or making a scene. It was subtle, insidious, like she was slowly wearing me down, eroding my willpower bit by bit. And the worst part, she was always so damn calm, so composed. No matter what I did, no matter how much I yelled or tried to push her away, she never lost that eerie, unnatural calm. It was like nothing I did could affect her, like she was some kind of immovable object, unyielding and invincible. The only time I saw any emotion from her was when I tried to leave. That's when the mask would slip, just for a moment, and I'd catch a glimpse of something darker, something almost desperate. It was in the way her eyes would narrow, the way her voice would drop to a low, almost menacing whisper. "You can't leave me," she'd say, and there was an edge to her words that sent a shiver down my spine. "You belong to me." Those words haunted me. I didn't understand what she meant by them, but they echoed in my mind day and night, a constant reminder of the trap I had walked into. I knew I had to find a way out, but every time I tried to make a plan, she was there, watching, listening, like she could read my thoughts. And then things started to get worse. It began with small things, Strange noises in the night, shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I'd heard something, only to find her standing in the corner of the room, watching me with those unblinking eyes she'd always smile when she saw me looking. That same cold, unnerving smile that made my skin crawl. But then the nightmare started, and that's when I knew I was in real trouble. They weren't like normal dreams. These were vivid, horrifying visions that left me shaken and drenched in sweat when I woke up. I'd see her in the dreams, but she wasn't the calm, composed figure she was during the day. In the dreams, she was something else, something monstrous. I'd dream of her standing over me, her face twisted into a grotesque mask of rage, her eyes burning with an unnatural light. She'd scream at me, her voice distorted, inhuman, telling me I could never leave, that I was hers forever. I'd try to run, but no matter how fast I moved, she was always right behind me, her cold hands reaching for me, dragging me back into the darkness. I started to dread going to sleep, knowing that the nightmares were waiting for me. I tried staying awake, drinking coffee until my hands shook, but it only made things worse. The line between dreams and reality began to blur, and soon I couldn't tell if I was awake or still trapped in one of those twisted visions. One night, after yet another sleepless stretch, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I had to find a way to escape her, even if it meant leaving everything behind. I packed a small bag with some essentials and waited until she was in the bathroom. As soon as I heard the water running, I bolted for the door. But she was faster than I expected. I had barely made it into the hallway when I heard her voice behind me, sharp and cold. "Where are you going?" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare turn around, didn't want to see the look on her face, but I could feel her eyes on me, feel the weight of her presence bearing down on me like a physical force. "I need some air," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll be back soon." There was a long, agonizing pause, and for a moment I thought she was going to let me go, but then I felt her hand on my shoulder, cold and unyielding. "You don't need to leave," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Everything you need is right here." I turned slowly, my stomach twisting in fear, and saw that the mask had slipped again. Her face was twisted, her eyes narrowed in something that looked like anger, or maybe it was something else, something even more disturbing. There was a wildness in her eyes, a desperation that I hadn't seen before. "You can't leave me," she repeated, her grip on my shoulder tightening. "You belong to me." I tried to pull away, but her grip was like iron. She was stronger than she looked, much stronger, and no matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't break free. Panic surged through me as I realized just how trapped I was, how completely she had me under her control. "Please," I begged, my voice breaking, "just let me go. I can't do this anymore." But she didn't let go. Instead, she pulled me closer, her face inches from mine, and I could see the madness in her eyes, the twisted obsession that had taken hold of her. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling with intensity. "I need you. I can't exist without you. You're the only reason I'm here." Her words sent a chill down my spine. There was something deeply wrong with her, something beyond my understanding. It was like she wasn't just obsessed with me. She was dependent on me, like her very existence hinged on keeping me close. And that's when I realized the full horror of my situation. She wasn't just some strange woman who had shown up at my door. She was something else, something that had been created for me, something that couldn't survive without me. I had brought her into my life, and now she was bound to me, inextricably tied to my every move. I was her lifeline, and she was mine. The thought made me sick to my stomach, but there was no escaping it. She wouldn't let me go, and deep down, I knew I didn't have the strength to leave her. She had worn me down, broken me piece by piece, until there was nothing left but this twisted, parasitic relationship. As she held me there, her cold hands gripping my shoulders, I felt the last vestiges of my willpower slip away. I couldn't fight her anymore. I was too tired, too scared, too broken. "I won't leave," I whispered, the words bitter on my tongue. "I'll stay." Her face softened, and for a moment she almost looked relieved. She let go of my shoulders and stepped back, her smile returning, but there was something different in her eyes now. A sadness maybe, or regret. It was hard to tell. "Thank you," she said, her voice softening. "You've made the right choice." I wanted to scream, to lash out, to do anything to break free from her, but I couldn't. I was too far gone, too lost in the web she had spun around me. All I could do was nod and let her guide me back into the apartment, back into the darkness that had become my life. As the door closed behind us, I felt a crushing sense of finality, like I had crossed a line that I could never come back from. I was hers now, in every way that mattered. There was no escape, no hope for freedom, and deep down, I knew that it was only going to get worse. The days blurred into weeks, and the weeks into months. I lost track of time completely. My life had become a suffocating cycle of fear and resignation, every day a repeat of the last. She was always there, hovering at the edge of my consciousness, a constant presence that I could never escape. She never hurt me physically, but her control over me was absolute. Every decision I made, every thought I had, was influenced by her. It wasn't that she told me what to do. She didn't need to. She was inside my head, her voice a constant whisper that guided my actions, whether I wanted it to or not. I stopped going to work, stopped seeing friends. My world shrank down to the four walls of my apartment, and even that space didn't feel like mine anymore. It was hers, just like everything else. The only reason I stayed was because I knew that leaving wasn't an option. I had tried once, and I wasn't going to try again. The memory of that night, of the way she had looked at me, was enough to keep me in line. She didn't ask for much, at least not at first. She was content to just be near me, to watch over me with those cold, unblinking eyes. But as time went on, her demands grew. It started with little things, asking me to stay in bed longer, to sit with her while she watched TV, to hold her hand when we walked around the apartment. But then it escalated. She began to ask for my attention in ways that made my skin crawl. She'd demand that I look at her, really look at her, for hours on end. She'd insist that I tell her how beautiful she was, how much I needed her. It wasn't enough for her to be in my life. She needed to be the center of it, the only thing that mattered. And every time I resisted, every time I hesitated, she'd get that look in her eyes again, that desperate, almost feral look that terrified me more than anything else. I was losing myself to her, bit by bit. My thoughts, my desires, my very identity, everything was being consumed by her. I tried to hold on to who I was, tried to remember what my life had been like before she came into it, but it was like trying to hold water in my hands. The more I struggled, the faster it slipped away. And then one day, she made a demand that I couldn't ignore. We were sitting on the couch, the silence between us heavy and oppressive, when she turned to me with that unsettling smile on her face. "It's time," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Time for what?" I asked, my heart already pounding in my chest. I knew something was coming, something bad, but I didn't know what. She leaned in closer, her face inches from mine, and I could see the intensity in her eyes, the dark hunger that lurked behind them. "It's time for you to make the final commitment, to show me that you belong to me completely." I didn't understand what she meant, not at first, but then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver object. It was a scalpel, sharp and gleaming, and the sight of it made my blood run cold. "I need you to prove your love for me," she said, her voice calm, almost soothing. "I need you to mark yourself, to show the world that you belong to me." I recoiled, my mind reeling with horror. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I can't do that." But she just smiled, that twisted smile that sent shivers down my spine. "Yes, you can. You've already come this far. There's no turning back now." I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to get away from her, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped by her gaze, by the invisible chains that bound me to her. She placed the scalpel in my hand, her fingers cold against mine, and guided it towards my skin. "Do it," she whispered, her voice a dark command that I couldn't resist. "Show me that you belong to me." My hand trembled as the blade hovered over my forearm. I could feel the sharp edge pressing against my skin, the cold metal biting into my flesh. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stop, to drop the scalpel and run, but I couldn't. She was in my head, controlling my every thought, my every movement. And then, with a sickening certainty, I realized that there was no escape. She had me completely, body and soul. There was no going back, no fighting her anymore. I was hers, just as she had always said. I pressed down on the blade, and a sharp pain shot through my arm as it sliced into my skin. Blood welled up, dark and thick, and the sight of it made me dizzy with fear and revulsion. But she was watching, her eyes locked on mine, and I knew I couldn't stop. I carved the first letter into my arm, the pain so intense it made my vision blur, and then the second, and the third. Each cut was a confirmation, a final surrender to the darkness that had taken over my life. The letters spelled out her name, her real name, the one she had whispered to me in the dead of night, the one that had haunted my dreams. When it was done, I dropped the scalpel, my hand shaking, and looked at her. Her face was alight with a twisted kind of joy, her eyes shining with satisfaction. She reached out and touched the fresh wound, her fingers gentle, almost loving. "You did it," she whispered, her voice filled with a sickening pride. "Now you're mine, completely and forever." I collapsed back onto the couch, the pain in my arm radiating through my entire body, but it was nothing compared to the agony in my soul. I had given in to her, given her everything she wanted. There was nothing left of me, nothing but the hollow shell of the person I used to be. She curled up next to me, resting her head on my shoulder, and I could feel the cold weight of her presence pressing down on me. "We'll be together forever," she whispered, her voice soft and soothing, like a lullaby. "Just you and me. Isn't that what you wanted?" But I couldn't answer. I couldn't even think. All I could do was sit there, staring blankly at the wall, my mind numb, my heart dead. As the hours passed, I felt myself slipping further into the darkness, into the void that she had created within me. I was no longer a person, no longer an individual with thoughts and desires of my own. I was hers, and that was all that mattered. The world outside faded away, and I knew that I would never see it again. I was trapped in this nightmare, bound to her by chains that I could never break. And as the darkness closed in around me, I realized the final, terrible truth. I had ordered a girlfriend from the deep web, but what I got was something far worse, something that had taken everything from me until there was nothing left but the cold, empty void where my soul used to be. And now I was nothing but hers. My father worked on a secret deep web project for the pyramids. He is hiding something in the basement. I don't even know where to start with this. I'm writing this now because I can't hold it in anymore. And honestly, I'm scared out of my mind. It's not the kind of fear you get from watching a horror movie or walking through a dark alley at night. It's deeper than that. It's the kind of fear that makes your skin crawl, your stomach churn, and your heart feel like it's going to stop at any second. It all started with my dad. He's always been a weird guy, kind of distant and always working on something. Growing up, he wasn't around much. He was always down in the basement, working on projects, as he called them. Whenever I'd ask him what he was doing, he'd just give me a vague answer or change the subject. I figured it was just work stuff, maybe something he wasn't allowed to talk about. My mom died when I was young, so it was just the two of us. The basement became this forbidden place, and I learned pretty quickly not to ask too many questions. But recently, something changed. It's hard to explain, but the vibe in the house just got wrong. The air felt thick, like you could cut it with a knife. I started hearing things at night, like a low humming noise coming from the basement. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, like something was alive down there. And then there was the smell. It was this sickly, sweet smell that seemed to seep up through the floorboards. It made me gag every time I caught a whiff of it. One night, I heard my dad arguing with someone in the basement. His voice was low, almost like he was trying to keep it down, but I could tell he was pissed. I couldn't hear the other person at all, but the conversation was heated. After that night, the vibe got even worse. I'd hear strange noises coming from the basement, like scraping, dragging, and this weird wet sound, like something being torn apart. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. Then one night, I was lying in bed when I heard my dad leave the house. It was around midnight, and he almost never went out that late. I waited for a bit to make sure he wasn't coming back, and then I decided to go down to the basement. I figured I'd just take a quick look, see what was going on, and get out. But when I got to the basement door, I realized I didn't have the key. It was locked, like it always was. I was about to head back upstairs when I noticed something. The key was hanging on a hook next to the door. That was weird, because my dad always kept it on him. He never left it lying around. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed the key and unlocked the door. The smell hit me first. It was that same sickly sweet smell, but stronger. It was so strong that I almost threw up right there. I had to cover my mouth and nose with my shirt just to keep from gagging. I flicked on the light and started down the stairs. The basement was big, way bigger than I remembered. It looked like it had been expanded, like my dad had been digging out more space or something. The walls were lined with shelves, all filled with weird stuff. Books in languages I couldn't read, jars filled with strange liquids and unidentifiable objects, and a bunch of old computers. There were wires everywhere, connecting the computers to some kind of machine in the corner of the room. It looked like a giant metal box with a bunch of screens and buttons on it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I found on the floor. There was a large tarp spread out, and underneath it I could see the outline of something big, something human-shaped. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it was going to burst out of my chest, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to see what was under that tarp. I reached down and pulled it back, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a body, a human body, but it wasn't just any body. It was wrong. The skin was pale and waxy, like it had been dead for a while, but the limbs were all twisted and contorted in unnatural ways. The face was the worst part. It looked like it had been melted or something, like someone had taken a blowtorch to it. The eyes were wide open, staring up at the ceiling, and the mouth was frozen in this horrible, twisted scream. I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet, and that's when I saw the other bodies. There were 3 more, all lined up against the far wall, covered in the same way. Each one was just as messed up as the first. Some of them were missing limbs, and others had these deep, gaping wounds that looked like they had been made by some kind of tool. But they all had the same look on their faces, that same twisted scream. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at those bodies, but eventually I snapped out of it. I turned to run back upstairs, but that's when I noticed something else. There was a door at the back of the basement that I had never seen before. It was small, almost like a hatch, and it was slightly ajar. I don't know what made me do it, but I walked over and pulled it open. The door led to a narrow tunnel, barely big enough for me to stand up in. The walls were rough and dirt-covered, and the air was damp and cold. I could hear something coming from the other end of the tunnel, a faint mechanical sound, like a machine running in the distance. I should have turned back. I should have run out of that basement and never looked back. But something pulled me forward, like I was in a trance. I walked down the tunnel, my heart pounding in my ears, until I reached the end. What I saw there, I still can't wrap my head around it. The tunnel opened up into a small room, and in the center of the room was this massive metal structure. It looked like a cage, but it was filled with wires and tubes, all connected to a platform in the middle. And on that platform was something. I don't even know how to describe it. It wasn't human, but it wasn't exactly an animal either. It was this twisted, grotesque mass of flesh and metal, with these long, spindly limbs and a head that was too large for its body. It was twitching, like it was alive, but it wasn't moving. It just lay there, making these awful, guttural noises. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran back up the tunnel, back into the basement, and slammed the door shut behind me. I locked the basement door and ran up to my room, locking myself in. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. All I could see whenever I closed my eyes was that thing in the cage and those bodies on the floor. The next morning, my dad was back. He acted like nothing was wrong, like everything was completely normal, but I could see it in his eyes. He knew I had been down there. I tried to ask him about it, about what I had seen, but he just brushed me off, saying it was all part of his work, that I shouldn't worry about it. But I can't stop worrying about it, because ever since that night, things have gotten even worse. The noises have gotten louder, and the smell is almost unbearable. I keep hearing whispers in the middle of the night, like someone is standing right next to my bed. And my dad, he's been acting stranger than ever. He's always watching me, like he's waiting for something, like he knows something is going to happen. I don't know what to do. I'm scared, and I feel like I'm losing my mind. But I have to find out what's going on. I have to know what my dad is hiding in that basement. Because whatever it is, I think it's getting closer. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Like, really watched. It wasn't just my dad anymore. It felt like the house itself was keeping an eye on me. Every creak in the floorboards, every shadow that seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. It all felt wrong. It got to the point where I'd sleep with the lights on. Not that I got much sleep anyway. My dad started acting even more paranoid. He wouldn't let me out of his sight for too long, and he'd constantly ask me where I was going, what I was doing. He'd stand outside my room at night, just listening. I could hear his breathing through the door, slow and steady, like he was waiting for me to make a move. One day, I came home from school and found him in my room. He was going through my stuff, rummaging through my drawers, my closet, even under my bed. When I asked him what the hell he was doing, he just gave me this blank look and said he was cleaning. But his eyes told a different story. They were wild, almost desperate. He didn't say anything else, just pushed past me and left the room. That's when I knew I had to dig deeper. I couldn't just sit around and wait for whatever was coming. I had to find out what the hell was going on. So that night, after my dad had gone to bed, I started searching the house. I went through his office first, his desk, his files, his computer, but I didn't find much. Just a bunch of technical stuff I didn't understand. I was about to give up when I noticed a small locked drawer in the desk. It was the only thing in the office that was locked, so I knew it had to be important. I didn't have the key, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. I grabbed a screwdriver from the kitchen and managed to pry the drawer open. Inside, there was a single item, a leather-bound journal. It was old, the leather cracked and worn, but when I opened it, the pages were filled with my dad's handwriting. The journal was disturbing, to say the least. The first few entries were normal enough, just notes about work, stuff about the pyramids and some kind of project he was working on. But as I kept reading, the entries got darker, more frantic. He started writing about the subject in the basement, how it wasn't responding the way it was supposed to, how it was changing, becoming something else. He wrote about experiments, horrible, twisted experiments. There were details about things he'd done to the bodies in the basement, things I can't even bring myself to repeat. He talked about how they weren't just bodies, how they were something more, something ancient. There were drawings too, weird symbols and diagrams that didn't make any sense to me. But the last few entries, those were the worst. He started writing about how the project was getting out of control, how he couldn't stop it, how it was consuming him, taking over his mind. He talked about the voices, how they were getting louder, telling him to do things, terrible things. He said he was afraid of what he might do next. The final entry was just one line. It's too late. It's already here. I didn't know what to make of it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the journal. My dad had always been a bit strange, but this was something else entirely. It was like he was losing his mind, or maybe he already had, but that didn't explain everything. It didn't explain the bodies in the basement or that thing in the cage. I had to know more. I had to find out what the hell my dad had gotten himself into. So I started digging online, trying to find anything that might explain what was happening. I ended up on some pretty sketchy websites, the kind you only hear about in rumors, the deep web. I didn't really know what I was looking for, but after a while, I stumbled across something. There was this forum hidden deep in the dark corners of the internet, where people were talking about projects similar to what my dad had written about. They called it the Pyramid Project, and it was some kind of ancient ritual, a way to awaken something that had been sleeping for thousands of years. The people in the forum talked about it like it was real, like it was something they were actively involved in. One of the posts caught my eye. It was from someone claiming to have been a part of the project, someone who had seen what it could do. They talked about how it started with the pyramids, how they were more than just tombs. They were conduits, channels for something ancient and powerful. The project was supposed to harness that power, to use it for something, but things had gone wrong. The power was too strong, too dangerous. It had started to corrupt everything it touched, warping reality itself. The post ended with a warning. Once it's awakened, there's no going back. It will consume everything. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It sounded like something out of a horror movie, but deep down, I knew it was real. I could feel it in my bones. Whatever my dad had been working on, whatever he had awakened in that basement, it was something ancient, something evil, and it was growing stronger. That night, the noises got worse. I could hear them, even with my door closed and the covers pulled over my head. They were louder, more distinct. I could hear the dragging, the scraping, and something else. Something that sounded like whispering, but not in any language I'd ever heard. It was like the walls themselves were speaking to me, trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. I stayed up all night, huddled in bed, listening to those awful sounds. And then, just before dawn, I heard something new. A voice, clear as day, coming from the basement. It wasn't my dad's voice. It was deeper, more guttural, like something from the bottom of a well. And it was saying my name. "Come down, Jacob," it said. "We've been waiting for you." I froze. My heart stopped in my chest, and I felt like I was going to pass out. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. The voice kept calling my name over and over, getting louder and more insistent. "Come down, Jacob. Come and see." Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed and ran to my door, throwing it open. The voice stopped immediately, and the house was dead silent. I stood there for a moment, just listening. There was nothing. No noise, no movement, just silence. I slowly made my way down the hall, my heart pounding in my ears. The basement door was at the end of the hall, and it was wide open. I don't know why I did it, but I walked over and looked down the stairs. The light was on, casting long shadows on the walls, but I couldn't see anything. I just stood there, staring down into the basement, my mind racing. I knew I should turn back, lock myself in my room, and wait for morning, but something was pulling me forward, like a hand on my back, pushing me down the stairs. I took a step forward, then another, until I was standing at the top of the stairs. That's when I heard it, the sound of something moving in the dark, just beyond the edge of the light, and then a low, wet growl that made my blood run cold. I turned and ran back to my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat on my bed, clutching the journal, and listened to the sounds of something moving through the house, just outside my door. I don't know how much more of this I can take. Something is in the house with us. Something my dad brought back from whatever the hell he was working on. And it's getting closer. I don't know what it wants, but I know it's not going to stop until it gets it. And the worst part, I think my dad knows exactly what it is, and he's not doing anything to stop it. The morning after that nightmare of a night, I could barely drag myself out of bed. My body felt heavy, like I was carrying a load of bricks on my back. But my mind was racing, flooded with images of that thing in the basement, the growl, the whispering voice that called my name. I hadn't heard a peep from my dad since I locked myself in my room, and the silence was suffocating. I knew I couldn't avoid him forever. Whatever was happening, I needed answers. I needed to know what the hell he had been doing down there, what he'd unleashed in our home. But when I finally forced myself out of my room and headed downstairs, I found him in the kitchen, acting like everything was fine. He was sitting at the table, drinking coffee, reading the newspaper, just like he did every other morning. If he noticed the dark circles under my eyes, or the way my hands were shaking, he didn't say a word, but I couldn't let it go. I sat down across from him, staring at him, trying to find the right words. My throat felt like it was closing up, but I managed to force out a question. "What's in the basement, Dad?" He didn't look up from his newspaper. He just took a slow sip of his coffee, like I'd asked him about the weather or something, but I saw his hand tremble slightly, just for a second. That's when I knew he was hiding something he didn't want me to know. "Nothing you need to worry about," he finally said, his voice calm and measured. "Just a project I'm working on." "A project?" I repeated, my voice rising. "What kind of project has dead bodies and that thing in a cage?" That got his attention. He set the newspaper down and looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in weeks. His eyes were bloodshot, the skin around them dark and bruised, like he hadn't slept in days. But there was something else there too, something cold and calculating, like he was weighing his options, deciding how much he was going to tell me. "You shouldn't have gone down there, Jacob," he said quietly. "You weren't supposed to see that." "See what? The bodies? The creature? What the hell are you doing down there, Dad?" I was practically shouting now, my voice cracking with fear and anger, but he just shook his head, a hint of a smile curling at the corner of his mouth. "It's not what you think. Those bodies, they're not human. Not anymore." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "What do you mean, not human?" "They were once, but the project, it changes things, Jacob. It's all part of the process, part of the awakening." "The awakening?" My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what he was saying, but none of it made any sense. "What are you talking about? What did you do?" "I'm protecting us," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "This is bigger than you can understand. The power in those pyramids, it's been buried for millennia, waiting for the right moment. We're unlocking something ancient, something that will change everything." "Change what? The world? People?" I was struggling to keep my voice steady, but it was impossible. "You're talking like a madman. This isn't right, Dad. You have to stop." "Stop?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't stop something like this, Jacob. It's already started. It's been set in motion and now we have to see it through. If we don't, well, the consequences would be far worse than a few bodies in the basement. His words were like ice water being poured over me. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to do something to snap him out of this madness, but I couldn't move. I just sat there, numb, my mind refusing to accept what he was saying. That's when he reached across the table and grabbed my hand. His grip was strong, almost painfully so, and I could see the veins bulging in his arm, his knuckles white. "I need you to trust me, Jacob," he said, his voice low and intense. "I'm doing this for us, for our family. You don't have to understand it, but you have to trust me." I stared into his eyes, trying to find some trace of the man I knew, the father who had raised me, but all I saw was a stranger, someone who had been consumed by whatever darkness he had brought into our home. I couldn't trust him, not anymore, but I couldn't tell him that. I was too scared of what he might do. "Okay," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I trust you." He held my gaze for a long moment, searching my face for any sign of deception, but eventually he let go of my hand and nodded. "Good. Now stay out of the basement, Jacob. I mean it. If you go down there again, I won't be able to protect you." He got up from the table and left the room without another word, leaving me sitting there, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew he was serious. Whatever was happening in that basement, whatever he had awakened, it was beyond anything I could comprehend. But I couldn't just ignore it. I couldn't just pretend everything was okay. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to go about my usual routine, but I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept drifting back to the basement, to the journal, to the thing in the cage. I knew I should stay away, but the curiosity, the need to know the truth, was eating away at me. That night, after my dad had gone to bed, I made a decision. I was going back down to the basement. I needed to see for myself what was really going on down there, to understand what my dad had gotten involved in. I waited until the house was completely silent. Then I grabbed the key from its hook and quietly unlocked the basement door. This time, I didn't hesitate. I turned on the light and walked down the stairs, the smell hitting me like a punch to the gut. It was even worse than before. The sickly sweet stench of decay mixed with something else, something metallic and sharp. I could hear the faint hum of the machines, the soft, wet sounds of something shifting in the darkness. The bodies were still there, lined up against the wall, but they looked different somehow. The flesh was darker, almost black in places, and the faces were contorted into expressions of agony, like they were frozen in the moment of their death. I tried not to look at them as I made my way toward the back of the basement, to the door that led to the tunnel. I stood in front of that door for what felt like an eternity, my hand hovering over the handle. The memory of that thing, the creature in the cage, flashed in my mind, and I almost turned back, but something drove me forward, something stronger than fear. I opened the door and stepped into the tunnel, the air cold and damp, the walls rough and close. The sound of the machine was louder now, more distinct, and as I walked, I could feel the floor vibrating beneath my feet. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, but eventually I reached the small room at the end. The cage was still there, and so was the thing inside it, but it had changed. It was bigger now, its limbs longer and more twisted, the metal and flesh fused together in a grotesque parody of life. Its head was massive, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light, and its mouth hung open revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It was awake, and it was watching me. I could feel its gaze, cold and calculating, as if it was sizing me up, deciding whether I was a threat or just another piece of meat. I could hear the wet, slithering sounds of its limbs moving, the low growl rumbling from deep within its chest. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my ears, and that's when I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. There was a second cage, smaller than the first, tucked away in the corner of the room, and inside it was a person, or at least it had been a person. The body was twisted, contorted into an unnatural shape, the skin pale and stretched tight over the bones. The eyes were open, wide and unseeing, the mouth hanging open in a silent scream. But the worst part was the wires. They were embedded in the flesh, running in and out of the body, connecting it to the machine. It looked like the machine was feeding off the body, drawing something out of it, something dark and thick, like tar. I felt bile rise in my throat, and I had to cover my mouth to keep from screaming. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep my balance. I slammed the door shut behind me and ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time, not stopping until I was back in my room, the door locked and bolted. I don't know what my dad has done, what kind of deal he made, or what kind of monster he brought into our home. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever that thing is, it's not going to stay in that cage much longer. It's getting stronger, and it's hungry. And I think my dad is feeding it. The days after I saw the thing in the cage, no, after I saw them, blurred into a mess of fear and paranoia. I couldn't focus on anything. I could barely eat, couldn't sleep, and when I did manage to drift off, my dreams were plagued with twisted images of that creature and the contorted body in the second cage. Every creak of the house, every shadow that passed by my door sent a jolt of terror through me. I knew that whatever my dad was doing, whatever he was involved in, it was getting out of control. And the worst part was, I started noticing things about my dad, small things at first, like how his hands would twitch when he thought no one was looking, or how his eyes seemed to dart around the room, as if he was expecting something to jump out at him. He was jumpy, more paranoid than ever, and his mood swings were getting more extreme. One minute he'd be calm and collected, and the next he'd be shouting at me for the smallest thing, his face flushed with anger. But it wasn't just his behavior. His appearance started to change too. His skin was paler than usual, almost grey, and there were deep lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. His hair, once thick and dark, was thinning, and I noticed patches of it starting to fall out. His clothes hung off him like he was losing weight, even though I'd see him eating almost constantly, shoving food into his mouth like he was starving. It got to the point where I couldn't even be in the same room as him. Every time I looked at him, I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, like I was staring at a ticking time bomb. I knew something was wrong with him, something beyond just stress or lack of sleep. It was like he was rotting from the inside out. Then one night, everything came to a head. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of the basement, the journal, the things I'd seen. I was so wired I didn't even hear my dad come into my room until he was standing right next to my bed. I jumped, my heart nearly stopping in my chest, and turned to see him looming over me, his face half hidden in the shadows. "Jacob," he said, his voice low and almost tender, like he was trying to soothe me. "You've been avoiding me." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My mouth was dry, and my tongue felt like it was glued to the roof of my mouth. He sat down on the edge of my bed, his weight causing the mattress to dip, and reached out to brush a strand of hair from my forehead. His hand was cold, clammy, and I had to fight the urge to pull away. "You've been down there again, haven't you?" he asked, but it wasn't really a question. It was a statement, a fact. He already knew the answer. I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. "Dad, what's happening to you? What's in the basement?" He sighed, his breath rattling in his chest, and for a moment I thought he might actually tell me the truth. But instead, he leaned in closer, so close that I could see the tiny veins in his eyes, the dark circles beneath them, the way his skin seemed to sag off his bones. "There are things in this world, Jacob," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that you can't even begin to understand. Things older than anything you've ever read about in books. Things that have been here long before us, before this world was even a thought." He smiled, but it wasn't a smile I recognized. It was more of a grimace, like he was in pain, or like he was remembering something terrible. "They're waking up, Jacob. And when they do, we need to be ready." "Ready for what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "For what comes next," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "For the new world they'll bring. But to do that, I have to finish what I started. I have to feed it, nurture it, and then let it loose." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It sounded like something out of a nightmare, like some kind of insane cult rambling. "Dad, you're not making any sense. You need help. Whatever this is, it's not right. It's evil." His expression darkened, and for the first time, I saw real anger in his eyes. "Evil? You don't know the first thing about evil, Jacob. What I'm doing, what I've sacrificed. It's all for the greater good. You'll see. You'll understand soon enough." He stood up then, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of something under his shirt, just as it pulled tight across his chest. It was a flash, but it was enough. Something dark, moving under his skin, like a shadow or a parasite wriggling just beneath the surface. I recoiled, my breath hitching in my throat. What's happening to you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small glass vial filled with a thick, dark liquid. He held it up to the light, watching the way it swirled inside the vial, almost like it was alive. "I have to go now," he said, his voice distant, almost mechanical. "There's work to be done, but remember, Jacob, don't go down to the basement. Not tonight." With that, he turned and walked out of my room, leaving the door wide open behind him. I was left sitting in my bed, my heart pounding in my ears, my mind racing with what I'd just seen. But despite his warning, I knew I couldn't stay away. Not after that. I had to know what was really happening to him, what he was doing in that basement. So I waited until I heard the front door close, until I was sure he was gone. And then I got up and made my way back to the basement. The house was dark and silent, the only light coming from the dim bulbs hanging in the hallway. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the key and unlocked the basement door, but I couldn't stop myself. It was like I was on autopilot, driven by some force I couldn't control. The smell hit me as soon as I opened the door, even stronger than before. It was almost unbearable, the stench of rot and decay mingling with something sharp and metallic, like blood and iron. I gagged, covering my mouth with my sleeve, but I pushed forward, descending the stairs one slow, cautious step at a time. The basement was exactly as I'd left it. but the air felt thicker, heavier, like something was pressing down on me from all sides. The hum of the machines was louder, more insistent, and the wet, slithering sounds I'd heard before were now constant, like something was moving just out of sight. I made my way to the back of the basement, to the door that led to the tunnel, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to go back in there, didn't want to see what that thing had become, but I had no choice. I had to know. I opened the door and stepped into the tunnel, the air cold and damp against my skin. The walls felt closer this time, the darkness more oppressive, but I forced myself to keep moving, one foot in front of the other, until I reached the room at the end. The cage was still there, and so was the creature inside it, but it was different now. It was larger, its body more twisted, its limbs longer and more grotesque. The flesh and metal were fused together in a way that made my stomach turn, and the smell was overwhelming, a sickening mix of rot and something chemical, like burning plastic. But what really caught my attention was the second cage. It was empty. The body I'd seen before was gone, replaced by nothing but a few stray wires and the dark, sticky residue of whatever the machine had been drawing from it. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I didn't want to think about what had happened to that body, what my dad might have done with it. But then I noticed something else, something that made my blood run cold. There was a new cage, smaller than the others, tucked away in the corner of the room. It was covered in a thick tarp, but I could see the outline of something inside it, something that was moving. I felt a surge of panic, but I forced myself to move closer, my hands shaking as I reached out to pull back the tarp. And when I did, I felt my entire world collapse around me. It was my dad, or at least it looked like my dad, but he was changed, twisted in the same way the bodies in the basement had been. His limbs were contorted, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones, but his eyes were still his. They were wide open, filled with terror and pain, and they were staring right at me. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a low, wet gurgle. I could see the wires embedded in his flesh, running in and out of his body, just like the body in the other cage. But this time, there was no machine drawing anything from him. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at my dad's twisted, contorted body in that cage. Time seemed to stop, the world narrowing down to just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the faint, wet sounds of the wires burrowing deeper into his flesh. His eyes, those wide, terrified eyes, locked onto mine, and I could see the agony in them, the desperate plea for help that he couldn't voice. But I couldn't help him. I couldn't do anything but stand there, frozen in horror, as the reality of what he had become crashed down on me. Finally, my body seemed to remember how to move, and I stumbled back, my legs weak and unsteady. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything to release the terror clawing at my insides, but no sound came out. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart, the blood rushing in my ears, and the low rumbling growl from the creature in the larger cage. It was watching me again, its eyes glowing with that sickly yellow light, its body shifting and twitching as if it was barely containing the hunger within. I knew in that moment that whatever my dad had been trying to accomplish with his project, it had gone horribly, horribly wrong. He had been consumed by it, transformed into something less than human. I backed out of the room, my hands fumbling for the door, and slammed it shut behind me. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that basement as possible, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was happening in that basement, whatever that creature was, it was only a matter of time before it broke free. And when it did, there would be nothing left of my dad or of me. But I couldn't just leave him there. I couldn't let him suffer like that, trapped in his own nightmare. I had to do something, even if it meant confronting the very thing that had turned him into this monstrosity. So I made my way back up the stairs, my mind racing. There had to be a way to stop it, to end whatever madness my dad had started. I needed to find something, anything, that could give me an edge. I remembered the journal, the strange symbols and diagrams that didn't make sense at the time. Maybe there was something in there, some clue to undo what had been done. I tore through the house, searching for the journal. When I finally found it, buried under a pile of old papers in my dad's office, I flipped through the pages frantically, scanning the words, the drawings, the notes. There was something about the machine, about how it was connected to the ancient powers of the pyramids, how it was meant to channel them, to bring them into this world. But there were warnings too, scribbled in the margins, almost like an afterthought. It can't be controlled. The price is too high. It will consume everything. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely read the words, but I forced myself to keep going. There had to be a way to reverse it, to shut down the machine, to destroy whatever was in that cage before it was too late. And then I saw it. A symbol, drawn over and over again on the last few pages of the journal. It was a circle with jagged lines radiating out from the center, and beneath it, in my dad's handwriting, were the words, "The Seal of Oblivion." The only way to end it. I didn't know what it meant, but it was all I had. I grabbed the journal and ran back to the basement, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I was running out of time. The air was thick with tension, the smell of rot and decay almost unbearable. The creature in the cage was thrashing now, its growls growing louder, more insistent. It knew I was coming back. When I reached the door to the tunnel, I paused for just a moment, my hand trembling on the doorknob. I didn't want to go back in there, didn't want to face what was waiting for me, but I had no choice. I had to end this before it was too late. I pushed open the door and stepped into the tunnel, the cold air hitting me like a physical force. The sound of the machine was louder now, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I clutched the journal to my chest and forced myself to move forward, one agonizing step at a time. When I reached the room, I could see the creature straining against the bars of its cage, its limbs twitching, its eyes locked onto me with a terrifying intensity. But I ignored it, focused only on the smaller cage in the corner, where my dad was still trapped in that grotesque, twisted form. I approached the cage slowly, my heart in my throat. He was barely moving now, the life draining out of him with each passing second. I knew I had to act fast. The symbol, the seal of oblivion, was burned into my mind, and I knew what I had to do. I pulled out the journal and found the page with the symbol, then grabbed a piece of chalk from the shelf nearby. With trembling hands, I started to draw the seal on the floor around the cage, making sure to replicate every jagged line, every curve, exactly as it was in the journal. As I worked, I could feel the air in the room growing colder, the hum of the machine faltering, almost like it was reacting to what I was doing. The creature in the larger cage let out a deafening roar, slamming itself against the bars, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. When the seal was complete, I dropped the chalk and stepped back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The seal seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the lines glowing faintly in the dim light of the basement. I could feel it vibrating under my feet, a deep, thrumming power that made my skin crawl. And then, slowly, I saw the wires embedded in my dad's body begin to withdraw, like they were being pulled back by some unseen force. His body convulsed, his limbs twitching as the wires slid out of his flesh, leaving dark, oozing wounds behind. His eyes rolled back in his head, and for a moment, I thought he was going to die right there in front of me. But then, with a final shudder, the last of the wires pulled free, and he collapsed to the floor, limp and unmoving. I rushed to his side, my hands shaking as I tried to find a pulse, any sign of life. His skin was cold, clammy, but there was a faint, weak pulse under my fingertips, and I felt a surge of relief. He was alive. Barely, but alive. But the creature in the larger cage wasn't done yet. With a final, ear-splitting roar, it slammed itself against the bars with all its might, and I heard the sickening sound of metal giving way. The bars bent, twisted, and then snapped, and the creature burst free, its twisted form lumbering toward me with terrifying speed. I didn't have time to think, didn't have time to plan. I grabbed the chalk and drew the seal again, this time around myself and my dad, praying it would hold. The creature was almost on top of me now, its eyes glowing with a hunger that was beyond anything I'd ever seen. And then it hit the seal. There was a blinding flash of light, and the creature let out a scream, a high-pitched, keening wail that seemed to pierce right through me. The air around us crackled with energy, and I could feel the power of the seal pushing the creature back, forcing it away from us. For a moment, I thought it was over, that the seal had worked, but then I felt the ground beneath me begin to shake. The walls of the basement trembled, and the seal started to flicker, the lines growing dimmer, weaker. I realized with a sickening dread that the seal wasn't strong enough. Whatever my dad had unleashed, whatever he had been trying to control, it was too powerful. The seal could hold it back, but not for long. I grabbed my dad, pulling him to his feet as best I could, and we staggered toward the door, the creature thrashing behind us, its screams echoing through the basement. I didn't look back, didn't stop, not until we were out of the tunnel, out of the basement, and back in the safety of the house. We collapsed in the hallway, gasping for breath, and I looked at my dad, searching his face for any sign of the man I knew. His eyes were half closed, his breathing shallow, but there was a faint, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You stopped it. For now." But I knew the truth. I hadn't stopped anything. I had only delayed the inevitable. Whatever that creature was, whatever ancient power my dad had awakened, it was still down there, still growing stronger, and one day it would break free again. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know if we could ever truly escape what my dad had started, but I knew one thing for sure: the basement would never be safe again, and neither would we. I found leaked documents about my grandparents on the deep web. The next morning, my grandpa lost his hand, and I know why. Okay, so before I even start, let me just say that I'm not a person who easily believes in paranormal stuff, conspiracy theories, or any of that crap. I'm just an average guy who thought he'd mess around on the internet one night and stumbled onto something I wish I'd never seen. If you've ever been tempted to check out the dark corners of the internet just for kicks, take my advice. Don't. Seriously, just don't. It all started a few weeks ago when I was hanging out at my place, bored out of my mind. I'm talking the kind of bored where you just mindlessly scroll through the same 3 apps on your phone, hoping something interesting will magically pop up. But nothing ever does. Anyway, I'd heard about the deep web before, mostly from those late night YouTube rabbit holes you end up in. You know, the ones where they talk about creepy stuff, like hitmen for hire or weird illegal animal trading rings. I always thought it was BS, like just clickbait stories to get views. But that night, I was curious, maybe a little too curious. So I downloaded Tor, the browser you need to access the deep web, and started poking around. I didn't have any particular goal in mind, just seeing what was out there. Maybe find some old weird forums or something. At first, it was exactly what I expected. Janky looking websites with poor design, filled with sketchy links and text in languages I couldn't even begin to understand. There were marketplaces selling stuff you'd never find on eBay, chat rooms that seemed to have no purpose other than people exchanging bizarre theories, and a lot of dead ends. But then, after about an hour of clicking around, I found this one site. It didn't look like much, just a plain white page with a single search bar in the middle. Above the bar, in tiny, almost unreadable text, it said, "Curiosity is the beginning of all knowledge." Below that, there was just one button labeled Enter. No idea why, but I was drawn to it. So I clicked. It brought me to another page with a search bar. Only this time, it had another line of text. "Seek and ye shall find." Below that were categories. Stuff like government secrets, medical anomalies, historical records, and personal files. That last one caught my eye. It just seemed so out of place with the other categories, like it didn't belong there. I figured it was just some stupid hoax, or maybe a collection of random made-up stories, but I couldn't resist. I clicked on Personal Files, and the page loaded into another search bar. No instructions this time, just the bar, waiting for me to type something. I don't know why, but I typed in my last name. You ever do something so stupid that the second after you do it, you regret it immediately? Yeah, that was me. I sat there, staring at the screen, half expecting it to just say no results or something. But instead, a list of documents popped up. They were all labeled with names that I recognized. My grandparents, my parents, even some distant relatives I hadn't thought about in years. My heart started pounding in my chest as I scrolled through the list. Out of sheer morbid curiosity, I clicked on the file with my grandpa's name. My grandpa, man, he's this tough old dude. Used to be a steel worker before he retired. He's seen a lot in his life. Grew up during the Great Depression, fought in World War II, lost most of his friends in Vietnam. He's got these big, rough hands and this way of talking that makes you think nothing could ever faze him. But as I read through that file, I started to see him in a whole new light. The document was a mix of scanned images and typed text, like someone had pieced it together from different sources. There were old black and white photos of my grandpa as a young man, but not the kind you'd find in a family photo album. These were different. Some were taken from weird angles, like through a window or from a distance, as if someone had been watching him. There were also notes written in a cold clinical tone, describing experiments. That's when I started to feel sick. The documents talked about my grandpa being involved in something called Project Vanguard, some kind of secret government experiment back in the 50s. It didn't make any sense at first, but the more I read, the more I realized that it wasn't voluntary. The files described him as Subject 23B and detailed how he had been recruited under the guise of a government job, only to be drugged, abducted, and taken to a facility in the middle of nowhere. The experiments. Jesus, I don't even know if I can put into words what they did to him. They were obsessed with testing the limits of human endurance and pain tolerance. There were pages upon pages of reports on how they subjected him to extreme temperatures, sleep deprivation, chemical exposure, and something they called psychological conditioning. One report talked about how they forced him to watch graphic footage, war footage, violent crimes, all sorts of horrific shit, on loop for days while administering drugs to heighten his emotional response. They wanted to see how far they could push him before he broke. But that wasn't the worst part. There was this one section near the end of the file labeled results. It was just a single paragraph, but it was the most disturbing thing I've ever read. It described how, after weeks of torment, they tried something called the severance test. It didn't go into detail, just said that they wanted to see if they could sever a person's connection to their own body, not physically, but mentally. The idea was to make him lose all sense of ownership over his limbs, to feel like his arms and legs weren't his own. According to the report, the test was a success. I couldn't take it anymore. I closed the document and shut down my computer. I felt like I was going to throw up. All I could think about was my grandpa, the man who had raised me, taught me how to ride a bike, who always had a story to tell, no matter how many times I'd heard it before. I couldn't reconcile the man I knew with the person in that document. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the file, about what they did to him, about whether or not he remembered any of it. If he did, he never spoke a word about it, not to anyone. But what if he didn't remember? What if those memories were locked away somewhere deep in his mind, waiting to come out? The next morning, I got a call from my mom. She was hysterical, screaming and crying, and it took me a minute to understand what she was saying. My grandpa had been rushed to the hospital. He'd had some kind of accident. She kept saying, "He lost his hand. Oh my God, he lost his hand." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. There was no way it was a coincidence. I didn't know how, but I knew that whatever happened to him was connected to what I had found. I drove to the hospital as fast as I could, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. When I got there, I saw my grandpa lying in the hospital bed, heavily sedated, with his right hand completely gone, just a bandaged stump where it used to be. The doctors said he'd somehow managed to get his hand caught in the meat grinder at his house, but that didn't make any sense. My grandpa's hands were steady, strong. There's no way he would have just slipped. And then I remembered the file, the severance test, how they'd made him lose connection to his own body. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm convinced that whatever they did to him back then, it's still affecting him now. Maybe it's been dormant all these years, and somehow I triggered it by opening that file. I can't shake the feeling that I'm responsible for what happened to him. And the worst part, I can't tell anyone. Who would believe me? I wish I could say, that's where it ended, but it's not. This is just the beginning. There's so much more that I found, so much more that I'm afraid to even think about, let alone write down. But I need to get it out, need to warn people. If you're reading this, don't go looking for answers on the deep web. Some things are buried for a reason. Trust me, you don't want to dig them up. After what happened to my grandpa, I couldn't stop thinking about that damn file. Every time I tried to push it out of my mind, something would remind me of it. A random memory, a stray thought, the image of his mangled hand lying in that hospital bed. I kept replaying everything I'd read over and over, like my brain was trying to piece together some puzzle that didn't want to be solved. I didn't tell anyone what I had found. I couldn't. My family was already on edge, and the last thing they needed was for me to start spouting off about government conspiracies and secret experiments. But it was eating me alive. I had this gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach, this sense that something was deeply wrong and that it was far from over. A few days later, I found myself back at my place staring at my computer. I knew it was a bad idea, but it was like I was possessed. I had to go back. I had to see if there was more. Maybe there was something in those documents that could explain what was happening, something that could help me understand why my grandpa was suddenly falling apart after all these years. I booted up Tor again and navigated back to that same website. The plain white page, the search bar, it was all just as I remembered it, like it was waiting for me. I hesitated for a moment, my hands hovering over the keyboard, but then I took a deep breath and typed in my grandpa's name again. The same list of files popped up, but this time I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a new document at the top of the list, one that wasn't there the first time. It was labeled Addendum, Subject 23B. My heart skipped a beat. This was new. Someone had added this since the last time I was here. Against my better judgment, I clicked on it. The document was shorter than the others, but it was packed with information, disturbing, sickening information that made me wish I'd never opened it. It started with a summary of what I had already read: the experiments, the psychological conditioning, the severance test. But then it went further into something I hadn't seen before. Apparently, my grandpa wasn't just a random subject. He was part of a select group of individuals that the government had been experimenting on for decades, all under the guise of different projects with different names. Project Vanguard was just one of many. They'd been tracking him, monitoring his behavior, waiting to see if there were any long-term effects from the tests they had performed on him. And it wasn't just him. There were others, dozens of others. The addendum detailed how the government had set up a network of agents, people who were embedded in society, watching these subjects and ensuring that any incidents were kept under wraps. If something went wrong, if one of the subjects started to remember, or if the conditioning began to wear off, these agents were tasked with neutralizing the situation. They used phrases like containment protocols and damage control, which is just a nice way of saying they'd silence anyone who got too close to the truth. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was what came at the very end of the document. It was a list of dates and locations, places my grandpa had lived over the years, cross-referenced with reports of unexplained phenomena. Things like strange deaths, disappearances, and accidents, all of them linked back to him. One entry in particular made my blood run cold. It was dated 1972, a small town in Ohio where my grandparents had lived for a few years. The report mentioned a series of gruesome deaths that had occurred in the span of just a few months. The victims were all found mutilated, their bodies twisted and contorted in unnatural ways, with no apparent cause of death. The local authorities had written it off as some kind of freak accident or animal attack, but the document suggested otherwise. It hinted that my grandpa, or rather, what they'd done to him, might have been responsible. I started thinking back to some of the stories my grandpa used to tell me when I was a kid. Stories about the war, about the things he'd seen and done. I always figured they were just that, stories, but now I wasn't so sure. There was one in particular that came to mind, something he'd told me when I was maybe 10 or 11. It was late at night, and we were sitting out on the porch, just the two of us. He had had a few drinks, and he was in one of those moods where he liked to reminisce. He told me about a time during the war when his unit was ambushed. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and it seemed like all hope was lost. But then something happened. He didn't go into detail, just said that he blacked out, and when he came to, the enemy was dead. All of them. But it wasn't just that they were dead. He said they were torn apart, like some wild animal had gotten to them. And his hands, they were covered in blood, but he didn't have a scratch on him. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just one of those tall tales that old soldiers like to tell, maybe with a bit of truth mixed in. But now, after reading those documents, I couldn't help but wonder, was that story real? Had my grandpa done something that night? Something that wasn't entirely human? And if so, what did that mean for him now? What did it mean for me? I closed the document and shut down my computer again, but this time it didn't help. The images, the words, they were burned into my mind. I started to feel like I was being watched, like someone was keeping tabs on me, just waiting for me to slip up. Every time the phone rang, every time there was a knock at the door, my heart would skip a beat. I started looking over my shoulder, paranoid that one of those agents might be lurking around, ready to neutralize me if I got too close to the truth. But the worst was yet to come. The nightmares started a few days after I read that addendum. They were vivid, more real than any dream I'd ever had. In them, I was back in that facility, the one where they'd done those tests on my grandpa. I could see the cold, sterile rooms, the flickering fluorescent lights, the steel tables with straps on them. And in the middle of it all was my grandpa, but not the way I remembered him. He was younger, his face twisted in pain and rage, his body covered in scars and bruises. In the dream, I was strapped to one of those tables, unable to move, unable to speak. I could hear the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls, getting closer and closer. And then, just as the door would open, I'd wake up, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. But the worst part, the part that really messed with my head, was that every time I woke up, I could swear I saw something out of the corner of my eye. Just a shadow, a blur of movement, like someone or something was there, watching me. But when I'd turned to look, there was nothing. Just the empty room, silent, except for the sound of my own breathing. It's gotten to the point where I'm afraid to go to sleep, afraid of what I might see, or what might happen if I do. I've tried to stay awake as long as I can, but it's getting harder and harder. The lines between dream and reality are starting to blur, and I'm not sure how much longer I can hold on. There's still more to the story, more that I've uncovered, but I need to gather my thoughts, figure out what to do next. I know this isn't over, not by a long shot, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever is coming, it's going to be worse than anything I've seen so far. I just hope I'm strong enough to face it. The nightmares weren't the only thing that started happening after I read that addendum. My life, in general, began to feel like it was unraveling. It was like I'd opened some kind of Pandora's box, and now all the darkness and evil that had been locked away was seeping out, infecting everything around me. It didn't take long before weird things started happening, not just to me, but to everyone close to me. The first incident happened just a couple of days after the nightmare started. I was out grocery shopping, trying to distract myself with something normal, something mundane. I was in the produce section, just picking out some apples, when I noticed this old man standing at the end of the aisle. He was just staring at me. Now, you'd think an old guy in a grocery store wouldn't be that weird, but there was something about him that immediately set me on edge. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his face was expressionless, almost like he was in a trance. He just stood there, not moving, not even blinking. As I filled my cart, I tried to ignore him, but I could feel his eyes burning into me. I moved on to the next aisle, but when I looked back, he was still there, still staring. And then, out of nowhere, he started walking toward me, slow and deliberate, like he was a goddamn zombie or something. I could feel my heart rate picking up, but I told myself to stay calm. He was just some old guy, probably confused or lost. But as he got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. His right hand, it was missing, just like my grandpa's. Where his hand should have been, there was only a bandaged stump, red and swollen, like it had been freshly severed. I stared at it, unable to look away, as he continued to move toward me. His eyes never left mine, and in them, I saw something that terrified me. Recognition. He knew me. I don't know how or why, but I knew in that moment that this wasn't just some random old guy. There was a connection, something linking him to my grandpa, to everything I'd uncovered. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I turned and bolted out of the store, leaving my cart behind. I could hear the old man's footsteps following me, but I didn't dare look back. I just ran out of the store, into the parking lot, and straight to my car. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. When I finally did, I jumped in, locked the doors, and peeled out of the parking lot as fast as I could. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the old man chasing after me, but he was gone. The parking lot was empty. I didn't go home right away. I just drove, aimlessly, trying to calm myself down, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there were eyes on me, tracking my every move. When I finally got back to my apartment, I found something that made my stomach drop. My front door was unlocked. Now, I'm meticulous about locking my doors. Always have been, always will be. So the fact that it was unlocked meant one of two things. Either I'd been so freaked out that I forgot to lock it when I left, or someone had been inside while I was gone. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, half expecting to find someone waiting for me inside. But the apartment was empty. At least, it looked that way. But as I walked through the place, checking every room, every closet, I started to notice that things were slightly off. Little things, like the books on my shelf being out of order, or a picture frame on my desk being tilted. Someone had been in here, and they'd been looking for something. I checked my computer, the one I'd used to access the deep web, but it was untouched, or at least it seemed to be. I couldn't be sure. I had no way of knowing if someone had tampered with it while I was gone. And honestly, that scared me more than anything else. I was being targeted, but I didn't know by who or why. The next day, things escalated. I got a call from my mom, and from the second I heard her voice, I knew something was wrong. She was frantic, crying so hard I could barely understand her. I had to ask her to slow down, to tell me what happened. When she finally did, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My grandma had a stroke. She'd been perfectly healthy up until that point. No signs of any issues, but she just collapsed out of nowhere while she was making breakfast. My mom found her on the kitchen floor, unresponsive, and she'd been rushed to the hospital. The doctors said it was a massive stroke, and they didn't know if she'd make it. I went to the hospital immediately, but by the time I got there, it was too late. My grandma was gone. My grandpa, who was still recovering from the accident with his hand, was inconsolable. He kept saying it was his fault, that he should have been there, that he should have protected her. He wouldn't stop crying, and I'd never seen him like that before. It was like the strong, invincible man I'd known my whole life had been completely shattered. As I sat there in that sterile hospital room with my grandpa sobbing beside me, I couldn't help but feel this overwhelming sense of dread. This wasn't a coincidence. I knew that now. Whatever was happening, whatever I'd uncovered, it was spiraling out of control, and the people I cared about were getting caught in the crossfire. After the funeral, things got even worse. My grandpa started acting strange. He became paranoid, jumpy, always looking over his shoulder, like he was expecting someone to be there. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating, and he kept talking about them, the people who were after him, who had been after him for years. He wouldn't say who they were, but I knew. I knew it had to be connected to the experiments, to the files I'd found. He'd also started having these fits of rage, completely out of character for him. He'd lash out at the smallest things, smashing dishes, tearing up furniture. I found him one night in the garage, just standing there, staring at the wall, with blood dripping from his knuckles. He had punched the wall so hard that he'd split his hand open, but he didn't seem to notice. He just kept muttering under his breath, something about how they were coming for him, how he couldn't let them take him. I tried to get him help, tried to get him to see a doctor, but he refused. He said it was too late, that there was nothing they could do for him. He was a man on the edge, and I didn't know how to pull him back. And then, one night, everything came to a head. It was late, probably around midnight, and I was at home, lying in bed, unable to sleep. My mind was racing, going over everything that had happened, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. And then my phone rang. It was my grandpa. His voice was frantic, almost incoherent, and he was saying something about the room, that I needed to come to the house right away. He kept repeating it, over and over. The room, you need to see the room. I had no idea what he was talking about, but I could hear the desperation in his voice. I jumped out of bed, threw on some clothes, and drove over to his place as fast as I could. When I got there, the house was dark, except for a single light coming from the basement. The door was ajar, and I could hear my grandpa's voice coming from below. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. I made my way down the stairs, and what I saw when I reached the bottom made my blood run cold. The basement was a mess, furniture overturned, boxes scattered everywhere, but in the middle of it all was my grandpa, kneeling on the floor, frantically pulling up the floorboards. He was drenched in sweat, his hands covered in dirt and blood, and he kept muttering to himself, "I have to find it. I have to show him." I rushed over to him, tried to pull him away, but he shoved me back with more strength than I thought he had left. He kept digging, ripping up the boards with his bare hands until he finally uncovered something buried beneath the floor. It was an old metal box, rusted and covered in grime. My grandpa's hands were shaking as he pried it open, and inside was a stack of papers, yellowed with age. He grabbed them, thrust them into my hands, and said, "Read it. You need to know." I looked down at the papers, my heart pounding. The first one was a letter, written in a neat, precise hand. It was addressed to my grandpa, and as I read the words, I felt my stomach drop. Subject 23B has shown signs of resistance to the conditioning. Additional measures will be required to ensure compliance. If the subject becomes aware of his true nature, he will need to be neutralized immediately. Use of family members as leverage is authorized. I stared at the letter, my mind reeling. This was a warning, a threat, written decades ago, and it was clear that whoever had written it had been monitoring my grandpa for years, waiting for the moment when they could take him out. And now, it seemed that moment had finally come. I looked up at my grandpa, who was staring at me with wild, desperate eyes. "They're coming for me," he whispered. "They've always been coming for me, and now they're coming for you too." Before I could say anything, there was a loud crash from upstairs, the sound of the front door being kicked in. My grandpa's eyes went wide with fear, and he grabbed my arm, pulling me towards a hidden door at the back of the basement. "Go," he shouted. "You need to go, now. Don't let them find you." I tried to protest, to tell him I wasn't going to leave him behind, but he wouldn't listen. He shoved me through the door, slammed it shut behind me, and I heard the lock click into place. I pounded on the door, screaming for him to open it, but all I heard in response was the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, making their way down the stairs. And then, silence. I don't know how long I stood there, pressed against the door, waiting for something, anything to happen, but nothing did. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door and step out into the basement, it was empty. My grandpa was gone. All that was left were the overturned boxes, the ripped up floorboards, and the letter in my hand. I searched the house, but there was no sign of him, no sign of anyone. It was like they had just vanished. Now I'm back at my place, sitting here with that letter in front of me, trying to figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do. My grandpa warned me that they were coming for me, that they'd been watching me too. And after everything that's happened, I believe him. But the question is, what the hell do they want? And why now? After that night, everything in my life turned upside down. My grandpa was gone, disappeared without a trace, like he'd never existed. The police got involved, but it was a joke. They found the front door of his house kicked in, the basement torn apart, but no signs of him anywhere. They questioned me, of course, asked if I knew where he might have gone, but what could I say? That he'd been taken by some shadowy group that had been stalking him for decades, that he'd sacrificed himself to protect me from, what? Ghosts, agents, whatever the hell was hunting us. They wouldn't have believed me. Hell, I barely believed it myself. So, I kept my mouth shut, played dumb, and told them I had no idea where he could be. They didn't push too hard. Maybe they thought he'd just lost it after my grandma's death and wandered off. But I knew better. I knew something darker was at play. After they left, I tried to go back to living my life, but it was impossible. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything other than what had happened. I kept the letter with me at all times, folded up in my pocket, like some kind of twisted security blanket. It was a constant reminder that I was being watched, that they were out there somewhere, just waiting for the right moment to strike. I started noticing things, little things at first, but they quickly added up. My phone would randomly cut out during calls, leaving me with nothing but static. I'd catch glimpses of people I didn't recognize hanging around my building, watching me from a distance. One time, I saw a black car parked outside my apartment, and when I approached it, the driver sped off before I could get a good look. The paranoia was eating me alive. I couldn't trust anyone, couldn't go anywhere without feeling like I was being followed. Every time I left the house, I'd scan the streets, looking for anything out of place, anyone who seemed to be paying too much attention to me. And I'd always come back home with the feeling that I'd missed something, that there was someone just out of sight, watching, waiting. Then about a week after my grandpa disappeared, I got a package in the mail. No return address, no name, just a plain brown box sitting on my doorstep like it had been dropped there by a ghost. My first instinct was to throw it away, to get rid of it before it could do any more damage to my already frayed nerves. But curiosity got the better of me, and I brought it inside. I opened it up on my kitchen table, half expecting to find something horrible inside. A bomb, a severed finger, who knows? But what I found was somehow worse. It was an old VHS tape, unmarked, no labels, just the black plastic shell and the faint smell of dust. And at the bottom of the box, there was a note written in the same neat, precise handwriting as the letter my grandpa had given me. Watch this. It's time you understood. I stared at the tape, my hands shaking, my mind racing with all the possibilities of what it could be. Part of me didn't want to know, didn't want to see whatever was on that tape. But another part of me, the part that needed answers, that needed to understand what was happening, took over. I dug out an old VCR from the back of my closet, hooked it up to my TV, and popped in the tape. The screen flickered for a moment, and then the image stabilized. It was grainy, low quality, like it had been recorded decades ago. The first thing I saw was a room, cold, clinical, with white walls and harsh fluorescent lights. There was a single metal table in the center, with a man strapped to it. It took me a second to recognize him, but when I did, my heart nearly stopped. It was my grandpa, but he was younger, much younger, probably in his 30s. He looked terrified, his eyes wide and darting around the room, struggling against the restraints. And then, from off camera, I heard a voice, a calm, measured voice, the kind that sends chills down your spine without even trying. Subject 23B, commencing severance, test 03. The camera zoomed in on my grandpa's face as he started to scream, thrashing against the restraints, his muscles straining, but there was no sound. It was like the tape had been muted, like someone didn't want the audio to be heard. The only thing that came through was a low, droning hum, almost mechanical, that seemed to vibrate through the room, through my bones. I watched in horror as the scene played out. Doctors in white coats moving around him, adjusting equipment, injecting him with God knows what. They never showed their faces, only their gloved hands and the instruments they used to experiment on him. And then the camera shifted, focusing on my grandpa's right hand. I knew what was coming. but it didn't make it any easier to watch. The doctors started the severance test, as they called it, and I saw them insert needles into his arm, his hand, wiring him up to a machine that buzzed with energy, and then they started the procedure. The screen flickered again, and I saw it. His hand. It started to spasm, twitch uncontrollably, like it had a mind of its own. My grandpa's face contorted in agony, but his hand kept moving, twisting, like it was trying to tear itself away from his body. The doctors just stood there, watching, taking notes, as if this was all part of their sick, twisted plan. I wanted to turn the tape off, to stop watching, but I couldn't. I was frozen, my eyes glued to the screen, as the camera zoomed in even closer on his hand. And then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. His hand went limp, lifeless, and the doctors moved in again, removing the needles, disconnecting the wires. The camera panned back to his face, and I saw something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. His eyes, they were empty, hollow, like something had been taken from him, something vital, something that made him. He wasn't the same man anymore. Whatever they'd done to him, it had changed him, broken him in a way that could never be fixed. The tape ended abruptly, the screen going black, leaving me alone in the dark, the hum of the VCR still echoing in my ears. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing, trying to process what I'd just seen, but there was no processing it. How could I? How could anyone? I knew deep down that the tape wasn't just a warning. It was a message. Whoever sent it wanted me to know what they were capable of, what they'd done to my grandpa, and what they could do to me. It was a threat, plain and simple, a reminder that I was next. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my grandpa's face, the look of terror in his eyes, the way his hand twisted and writhed on its own. I could still hear that droning hum, feel it vibrating in my bones, like it was still inside me, pulsing, waiting to be unleashed. And then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, the sound of footsteps outside my door, slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth, just outside my apartment. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a baseball bat I kept under my bed. I crept to the door, my hands shaking, the bat clenched tightly in my fists. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then from the other side of the door, I heard a voice. Subject 23B. Compliance will be ensured. I froze, my blood turning to ice. That voice, it was the same one from the tape. Calm, measured, emotionless. I didn't know how, but they'd found me. They were here, outside my door, waiting for me to make a move. I didn't. I stood there paralyzed, listening as the footsteps started again, moving away from my door, down the hallway. And then silence. I didn't open the door. I didn't dare. I just stood there, bat in hand, until the first light of dawn crept through my windows. When I finally opened the door, there was nothing there. No sign that anyone had been outside. No footprints, no notes, nothing. But I knew they'd been there. I knew they were watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I'm running out of options, out of time. I don't know what they want from me, what their end game is, but I can't keep living like this. I can't keep looking over my shoulder, waiting for them to come for me like they did my grandpa. I need to find out who they are, what they did to him, and why they're targeting me. But I'm terrified of what I'll uncover, of what the truth might be. because if what I've seen so far is just the beginning, I don't know if I'll survive what comes next. I knew I couldn't stay in my apartment anymore. They knew where I was, and it was only a matter of time before they made their move. So, I packed a bag with whatever essentials I could grab and got the hell out of there. I didn't have a plan, no destination in mind, just the overwhelming need to get away, to disappear before they could get their hands on me. For the first few days, I hopped from one cheap motel to another, never staying in one place for more than a night. I kept my phone off, used cash for everything, and avoided public places. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I saw a stranger glance in my direction, every time a car followed me for more than a few blocks, my heart would race, and I'd find myself looking for the nearest exit, ready to bolt at a moment's notice. The paranoia was overwhelming, but it was also the only thing keeping me alive. I knew that if I let my guard down, even for a second, they'd find me, and I couldn't let that happen, not until I figured out what the hell was going on, why they were after me, and what they wanted. I kept thinking about that tape, about what they'd done to my grandpa. It haunted me, replaying in my mind like some twisted movie I couldn't turn off. The look in his eyes, the way his hand had moved on its own, it was all too much. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the answers I needed weren't just in the past. They were in the present too. Whoever had sent me that tape wanted me to know what they were capable of. They wanted to scare me, to push me into a corner. But they'd made a mistake. They'd given me a glimpse into their world, and now I was going to use that against them. I knew I had to go back to where it all started, the facility where they'd conducted those experiments, where they'd turned my grandpa into whatever it was they'd made him. I didn't know where it was, or if it even still existed, but I had a hunch. There was a town, not far from where my grandparents had lived, that my grandpa had always avoided. He'd never talked about it, never even mentioned its name, but I remembered it from the files I'd found on the deep web. It was the same town where those strange deaths had occurred, the ones linked to him. So I drove there. It took me a few hours, winding through back roads and small forgotten towns, but I finally made it. The place was even smaller than I'd imagined. A ghost town, practically abandoned. Most of the buildings were boarded up, the streets empty, with only a few scattered houses that looked like they'd seen better days. I found the facility on the outskirts of town. It was hidden in plain sight, disguised as an old factory, long since shut down. The windows were shattered, the doors rusted and hanging off their hinges, but I knew this was the place. It had to be. I parked my car a few blocks away and made my way to the building, every nerve in my body on high alert. The air was thick with tension, the silence oppressive. I half expected someone to jump out at me, to grab me and drag me inside, but nothing happened. The place was deserted. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The interior was even worse than the exterior, crumbling walls, broken tiles, and debris littering the floor. But there was something else too. The smell. It was faint, but unmistakable. The stench of decay, of something rotting. I followed the smell, moving deeper into the building, until I found what I was looking for. The room, the one from the tape. It was just as I'd seen it, cold, clinical, with the same metal table in the center, surrounded by abandoned equipment, but this time, there was no one strapped to the table No doctors, no cameras, just the remnants of whatever horrors had taken place here. I walked over to the table, my heart pounding in my chest. There was dried blood on the surface, old and crusted, and I could see the indentations where the restraints had once been. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, but I forced myself to keep going. I had to know. There was a cabinet in the corner of the room, its doors slightly ajar. I opened it, and inside I found what I'd feared. More tapes, dozens of them stacked neatly, each labeled with a different name, a different subject number. My grandpa's was there, along with others I didn't recognize. I pulled out a random tape, popped it into an old player I found nearby, and pressed play. The footage was the same as before, grainy, low quality, showing another person strapped to that same table, undergoing the same horrific experiments. I watched, transfixed, as the doctors repeated the process, same procedures, same twisted tests. And then, just as I was about to turn it off, I heard something. A voice. Subject 43B, proceed with final compliance protocol. I froze, my blood running cold. The voice. It was the same one I had heard outside my apartment, the same one from the first tape. But this time, there was more. As the camera zoomed in on the subject's face, I realized something that made my heart nearly stop. The subject. It was me. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was impossible. Yet there it was, right in front of me. The face on the screen was mine, younger, terrified, but unmistakably me. They'd done this to me too. Somehow, some way, they'd gotten to me. I watched, in horror, as the tape continued, showing the same twisted experiment, the same procedure, to sever my connection to my own body. But this time, something went wrong. The doctors started panicking, the equipment malfunctioning, and then just as the screen went black, I saw it. My hand. It moved on its own, just like my grandpa's had. But this time, it reached out and grabbed one of the doctors by the throat. The tape ended, leaving me in stunned silence. I didn't know what to think, what to feel. It was like my entire world had been turned upside down. I'd been one of their subjects, one of their experiments, just like my grandpa. And somehow, I'd forgotten, blocked it out, until now. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that, deep down, I knew it wasn't over. They'd tried to take control of me, to sever my connection to my own body, but something had gone wrong, and now they were trying to finish what they'd started. I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed as many of the tapes as I could carry and got the hell out of there. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stop. Not until I found a way to end this, to stop them from coming after me, after my family. I drove for hours, my mind racing, the tapes sitting in the passenger seat like some kind of cursed relic. I knew I had to watch them, had to see what else they'd done to me, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. Not until I was ready. But as I drove, I started to feel it. The same hum, the same vibration that I'd heard in the tapes, felt in my nightmares. It was faint, but it was there, pulsing through me, growing stronger with every mile. I knew what it meant. They were getting closer. I don't know how much longer I can keep running. I don't know if I can ever escape what they've done to me, what they've turned me into, but I have to try. I have to find a way to stop them, to end this nightmare once and for all. Because if I don't, I know what'll happen. I'll become just like my grandpa, broken, hollow, a puppet controlled by forces I can't even begin to understand. And that's something I can't let happen. Not now. Not ever. So I'll keep running, keep fighting, keep searching for answers. And maybe, just maybe, I'll find a way out of this before it's too late, before they come for me again.